The town square smelled like dust, sweat, and old wood baked by the late afternoon sun. A rough platform stood in the middle like a small stage for a play nobody wanted to watch to the end. Most of the crowd had already thinned out. Boots scuffed the dry ground as men drifted away in pairs and small groups, talking about cattle prices and winter feed, not about the woman still standing up there. The auctioneer wiped his brow with a stained sleeve and tried to sound lively, but even his voice had gone tired. Alia stood at the edge of the platform with her hands clasped tight in front of her, as if holding herself together took all the strength she had left. She was thin in a way that didn't look like hard work or missed meals alone. It looked like her body had been slowly emptied out. Her face was pale, her lips almost colorless, and her dark hair had been pulled back too neatly, like she'd done it out of habit even when she no longer had reason to care. When the wind lifted the loose ends, it showed how narrow her shoulders were, how light she seemed, as if a strong gust might carry her away. Down below, the last few men glanced up at her and then away again, almost embarrassed. Earlier, there had been a line of women. Some had been chosen quickly. Farmers had picked strong-armed girls who could milk cows and carry water. A merchant had wanted a woman with a pleasant smile who could keep a tidy shoproom. A widower had picked someone with kind eyes and steady hands, more interested in peace than beauty. Their choices had been met with nods and murmurs, like business done in plain daylight. But now there was only Alia. The auctioneer cleared his throat and slapped his ledger shut like he was ready to be done. Last one, he called, trying for cheer. No guarantees, gentlemen. You see her as she is. Final offer, and we'll close. A man near the back snorted. Too sickly. Another shook his head. Won't last a season. Waste of money, someone muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. Each word landed on Alia like a small stone. She didn't flinch, not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd heard worse before. She stared past the men's hats and sunburned faces, past the wagons and hitching posts, like she was looking at a place far beyond the town. Her breathing was shallow, careful. Every few seconds her chest tightened, as if her lungs didn't want to work anymore. She kept her chin up anyway. She told herself she wasn't surprised. She'd known how this would end the moment she stepped into the square. She had come because she had nowhere else to go. No family waiting, no home to crawl into, no money for a room. The doctor in the last town had said the word like it was already written in stone: consumption. He had tried to soften it after, but there was no soft way to say someone was running out of time. So Alia had walked until her legs shook. She had followed the road like it was the only thing still willing to carry her forward. She had thought maybe, if she was chosen, she would at least die under a roof. If she wasn't chosen, she would die wherever the cold found her first. Either way, she was tired of begging the world to let her stay. The auctioneer looked out at the thin crowd, then down at his notes, then back up again. He shrugged as if this wasn't personal, as if it was only the last item on a list. All right then, he said, if there are no bids. A few men turned away fully now. One laughed under his breath. Someone spat into the dirt. Boots started moving. The day was ending, and so was Alia's last chance. From the far edge of the square, a wagon stood half in shadow. Two men were there, not speaking much. One was broad-shouldered and steady, sitting on the wagon seat with the posture of someone who'd spent his life watching horizons. The other stood on the ground beside the wheel. He didn't look like a drifter or a shopkeeper or a farmer. He looked like a man who owned land and expected the world to make room for him. His coat was dark and well-made, dusty at the hem, and his hat sat low over eyes that missed nothing. Jonas, the man by the wheel, shifted and glanced at the one standing. "Boss," he said quietly, "what are we doing here?" The man didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on a platform, on Alia. His name was Ryan Hale. People in this territory said it like it meant something, like money and power had taken shape in a man and decided to ride around in boots. He owned the largest ranch for miles, maybe for all the counties around. His cattle brand was known at every rail stop. His horses were the kind men stared at with envy. And women didn't need an auction to chase a man like him. They found reasons to stand near him at church, to drop their handkerchiefs where he could pick them up, to smile in ways that promised easy comfort. Ryan Hale had no reason to be here, and everyone knew it. Yet he watched Alia like she was the only thing in the square that mattered. The auctioneer lifted his hand to bring it down. Going once, Alia felt her stomach sink. She knew the sound of endings. She knew what came after. The street, the cold, the long, lonely fade. Going twice. A cough rose in her throat. She swallowed it back, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her weak. Then a voice cut through the air, deep and sharp as a rifle crack. $500. The words were so wrong for the moment that the whole square seemed to freeze. Boots stopped. Head snapped around. Even the auctioneer stared like he'd misheard. Who said that? A man barked. The crowd parted as if pushed by an invisible hand. And there he was, Ryan Hale, stepping forward from the shadow, calm as if he were bidding on a stallion. Not a woman everyone else had dismissed. Jonas trailed behind him, looking like he wanted to argue, but didn't dare in front of witnesses. Whispers started at once, spreading fast. That's Hale. The Hale Ranch. He's bidding on her? Why her? Is he drunk? Alia's knees wobbled. She gripped the edge of the platform rail to steady herself. $500 wasn't just a bid. It was a fortune. It was more than most men in the square made in a year. She stared down at him, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but her mind felt slow, like it was moving through thick mud. The auctioneer blinked hard, then found his voice again, suddenly eager. Well now, he called too loudly. We have a bid. 500 from Mr. Hale. Do I hear 550? Any man want a match? No one moved. No one even pretended. The men who had called her a waste of money now looked nervous, like they might have insulted something valuable without knowing it. A few laughed awkwardly. Most just watched, confused and unsettled. The auctioneer swallowed. All right then. Going once, going twice sold. His gavel hit the wood with a sharp crack. Alia's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Sold. The word made her feel like she was falling, but also like she'd been grabbed at the last second before hitting the ground. She didn't know which feeling was stronger, fear or something dangerously close to hope. Ryan stepped up to the platform stairs. When he reached the top, he paused, looking at her the way a man looks at a truth he can't ignore. Up close, Alia could see details she hadn't from a distance. A scar near his jaw, lines around his eyes that weren't from laughter, a tightness in his mouth like he carried heavy thoughts and rarely set them down. He held out his hand. Alia stared at it, unsure. His palm was open, waiting, not grabbing, not demanding. Her fingers trembled as she placed them in his. His skin was warm, rough with work despite the fine coat. And the moment their hands met, something strange ran through her, like a jolt of electricity, like her body remembered what it felt like to be touched with care. She hated that it made her throat tighten. She hated that her eyes burned. Ryan's hand tightened just enough to steady her. And for the briefest second, his fingers shook too. Alia noticed. It scared her more than anything else. The auctioneer cleared his throat and looked between them with open suspicion, already counting money in his mind. Paperwork will be simple, he said. You'll want the usual. Later, Ryan said, and the word left no room for argument. He turned back to Alia. His voice lowered, meant only for her. Can you ride a wagon? Alia tried to speak. Her mouth was dry. She managed a small nod. It took all her strength not to cough. Ryan didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened, almost like relief. He guided her toward the steps, careful, as if she might break. When her foot slipped on the worn plank, his arm came around her waist to catch her. His hold was firm, protective. Alia felt how easily he could lift her, how light she was. The thought made shame flare in her chest, hot and painful. When her boots hit the ground, She swayed. Ryan didn't let go. People stared as they walked through the square. Men who had ignored her minutes ago now watched like she'd become a mystery they couldn't solve. A woman near the general store doorway crossed herself. Someone whispered, "He'll regret it within a week." Alia heard it. She also heard the pity behind it. The certainty. She stopped walking without meaning to. Her breath came shallow. She looked up at Ryan, panic rising because this couldn't be real. It couldn't last. Nothing good ever stayed. "You're making a mistake, sir," she whispered. Ryan's eyes didn't move from her face. His voice was calm, but it held steel underneath. "Let me be the judge of that." He guided her into the wagon as if she belonged there. Jonas took the reins, still looking troubled, and clicked his tongue to start them moving. The wheels creaked. The wagon rolled forward, away from the platform, away from the whispers, away from the life Alia had been ready to lose. As the town fell behind them, Alia sat stiff under the open sky, her hand still tingling where he'd held it. She didn't know what she feared more, that he would change his mind, or that he wouldn't. Behind them, the last voices of the square drifted like dust on the wind. 500, someone said, still stunned. On her. Must have gone mad. Alia swallowed hard and stared at the road ahead, the horizon wide and unforgiving. Beside her, Ryan Hale sat like a man who had made a choice he meant to stand by, no matter what it cost. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place she'd tried to bury, something small and fragile began to wake up. Hope. The wagon rolled out of town with a slow, steady creak, the kind that made you feel every bump in the road and every mile you put behind you. And as the last roofs and false front storefronts fell away, the land opened into a wide prairie that glowed gold under the lowering sun. Alia sat on the bench seat with her hands folded tight in her lap, trying to keep herself from shaking, trying to keep her breathing quiet, because every breath felt like it scraped on something tender inside her chest. And she didn't want to give anyone a reason to look at her with that same tired pity she'd seen in the square. But the wind was cool now. Even though the day had been warm, it slid right through the thin fabric of her dress. Jonas held the reins up front, his shoulders set, driving like a man who'd like to be anywhere else. And every so often he glanced back over his shoulder with the cautious look of someone watching a storm form on the horizon, while beside Alia, Ryan Hale sat in a silence that felt heavy, not unfriendly exactly, but full of thoughts he wasn't offering, and Alia didn't know what to do with a man who didn't demand explanations or favors the second he got what he paid for. For a long time, all you could hear was the wagon wheels, the leather tack, the distant call of a bird settling into evening, and the faint rustle of grass. And it was so quiet that Alia's own heartbeat sounded loud in her ears. So she finally forced her voice to work, thin as it was, and said, "Sir, I should tell you something." And even that small sentence cost her more breath than it should have. Ryan's eyes shifted to her, steady and unreadable, and he waited like he had time, like she wasn't a task to be managed. Alia swallowed, her throat sore, and she tried again. "I'm very sick," because that was the truest thing she could offer, the one honest warning she owed him before he decided she had tricked him. And she saw Jonas tense at the words as if he'd been waiting for this. But Ryan didn't flinch, didn't look surprised, only said, low and even, "I didn't ask you to work yourself to death." And that answer confused her so much she almost forgot to be afraid. She stared at him, searching his face for the hidden price, the bargain, the reason, because men didn't spend $500 just to be kind. Not in her world, not in any world she'd known. And her confusion grew until she tried to press again. I won't be of much use," the doctor said, but the words broke when a cough rose up fast and hard, bending her forward. She turned away on instinct, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth, willing the fit to pass without showing what she already knew was there. And when it did, she kept the cloth hidden in her fist, curled tight so no one could see the dark stain. Still, Ryan had seen enough. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his cheek. And though he said nothing, The air around him changed, like a man making a quiet decision he didn't want anyone to interrupt. The wagon rolled on through the last light, and as the sun dipped lower, the prairie caught fire with color, amber, red, and soft purple shadows stretching long across the grass. And in the distance, Alia began to see it, a spread of buildings and fences and moving dots that were cattle, all of it wide and organized and alive. And even from far off, she could tell it wasn't some struggling homestead scraping by, but a ranch that breathed money and control. The sight made her stomach twist because places like that didn't have room for someone like her, someone thin as a rail with hollow cheeks and borrowed time. And she heard herself whisper, almost without meaning to, "I don't belong in a place like this." And Ryan, still watching the land ahead like it was part of him, answered, "You're here now. That's what matters." As if belonging was something you could decide with a sentence. They reached the ranch as evening turned to dusk and lanterns flickered on in windows, and the main house came into view. Large, clean-lined, solid, built with care and money, not fancy like an Easter mansion, but proud in a quiet way, with a wide porch and posts that cast long shadows across the yard. Alia expected to be led around back to some small room near the kitchen or the barn, because that was where purchased women went. But when the wagon stopped and Ryan helped her down, his hand on her elbow gentle but firm, he guided her straight up the front steps, past a pair of rocking chairs and a coiled rope, and through the front door, as if he had every right to bring her there. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish, soap, and something warm from the kitchen, and a woman stepped out of a side hall with quick, practiced steps. Mrs. Chun, small but sharp-eyed, her dark hair pinned neatly her face calm until her gaze landed on Alia's pallor, and then worry crossed her features like a shadow. She looked from Alia to Ryan as if asking questions without words, and Ryan spoke first. "Mrs. Chun, this is Alia. She'll be staying here." And Mrs. Chun didn't gasp or protest, only nodded once and came closer, her eyes already taking stock of Alia's trembling hands and the faint sheen of sweat near her hairline. "You are cold," Mrs. Chun said, her voice gentle but sure, and before Alia could deny it, Mrs. Chun had her by the arm, steering her inside with the practiced care of someone who'd seen sickness before. Alia expected, any moment, for Ryan to hand her off like a purchase delivered, but instead he walked with them. And when they reached a hallway lined with framed photos and a mirror that caught the lamplight, he opened a door and gestured her in. It wasn't a cramped servant space. It was a guest room, bright even at night because the lamp was already lit, clean white bedding turned down, a wash basin with fresh water, a small vase with dried flowers on the dresser, and a window that looked out toward the darkened fields. Alia stood in the doorway, stunned because she had never been offered a room like this in her life, not without strings attached, and her eyes burned so fast she had to look down. "You'll sleep here," Ryan said, and his voice was careful, like he was trying not to startle a wounded animal, and Alia managed, "Sir, I can't." But he cut her off without raising his tone. "You can," and then he turned and left her there, as if it was settled law. When the door closed, Alia's knees gave out, and she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the quilt beneath her hands, feeling the softness like it was unreal, and then the tears came hard and silent, the kind that shook her ribs and made her press her fist against her mouth to keep from making noise, because she didn't even know what she was crying for. Relief, fear, shame, gratitude, all of it tangled together. Down the hall, in a room lined with books and papers, Ryan poured whiskey into a glass and stared into a fire that hadn't been lit for warmth so much as habit. And Jonah stood in the doorway, finally letting the words spill out. "You want to tell me what this is really about?" And Ryan didn't look at him, only swirled the amber liquid once as if buying time. "She needed help," he said, but Jonah stepped in, voice low and sharp. "You've never helped a stranger like this. Not like this. You bought her, boss, and you did it like you're planning to keep her." And for a second, Ryan's hand tightened around the glass, the only sign the words hit home. He exhaled through his nose, eyes still on the fire, and said, almost like a confession he didn't mean to make, "I don't know what I'm planning," and Jonas stared at him like he didn't recognize him. Later, when the house went quiet and the ranch settled in a night, Alia lay into the quilt, but sleep wouldn't take her because her bones ached and her skin felt too hot. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw the auction platform and heard those voices, too sickly, waste of money, and she wondered what would happen when Ryan decided they were right. Her fever rose in slow waves, and she curled on her side, shivering despite the warmth, until a soft knock came at the door and Mrs. Chun entered carrying a tray with broth and a small bottle that smelled of herbs. "Drink," Mrs. Chun said, and when Alia tried to protest, she gave her a look that allowed none of it. So Alia sipped, the heat easing her throat. Mrs. Chun touched the back of Alia's hand. Cool fingers, gentle pressure, then adjusted the blanket around her shoulders like she'd done it 100 times. Alia's voice came out small. "Why is he being so kind?" And Mrs. Chun paused, her expression turning thoughtful in a way that made her seem older than the lamplight showed. "That man has his reasons," she said quietly. "Always does." And then, after a beat, she added, "But I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you today," and the words settled over Alia like both comfort and warning. Sometime after midnight, Alia finally drifted into a shallow sleep, and outside on the porch, Ryan stood alone with his hands resting on the railing, the night air cool against his face, his gaze fixed on the faint glow from the guest room window, as if it were the only light that mattered. And when Jonas stepped out beside him, boots soft on the boards, he didn't speak at first, only watched his boss the way you watch a man walking toward a cliff. "You're falling for her, aren't you?" Jonas said at last, and Ryan's shoulders barely moved as he answered, so quiet it almost got lost in the wind. "She's dying, Jonas." And Jonas didn't let him hide behind that, not tonight. "That's not what I asked," he said, and Ryan didn't reply. But the silence did, because his eyes stayed on that window like he was afraid that if he looked away, something precious would vanish. And in the distance, the prairie stretched endless and dark, holding its secrets close, while inside the house woman everyone had left behind slept under clean blankets for the first time in longer than she could remember, unaware that the man watching her light wasn't just guarding a guest. He was guarding a choice he didn't fully understand, and the night itself seemed to lean in, listening, as if it knew tomorrow would bring answers neither of them were ready to face. Morning came soft and pale over the Hale Ranch, and Alia woke before the rooster even tried. Not because she felt strong, but because her fear wouldn't let her rest. She lay there for a moment listening to the house creak, then forced her legs over the side of the bed and stood slowly, waiting for the room to stop spinning, telling herself that if she stayed useful, if she stayed quiet, if she didn't become a burden, then maybe this mercy wouldn't be taken away. She slipped down the hallway and into the kitchen, where the air was cool and smelled faintly of last night's wood smoke, and she found flour, eggs, and a pan, moving carefully so she wouldn't rattle anything loud enough to wake the house. Her hands shook as she cracked an egg, and the shell broke wrong, and she had to scoop pieces out with trembling fingers, pretending it didn't matter, pretending she wasn't already losing the simple fight of standing upright. She braced one palm on the counter when her knees weakened, breathing slow, and that was when a deep voice behind her made her jump. "What are you doing?" Ryan stood in the doorway, fully dressed, as if he'd been awake for hours, his hat in his hand, his eyes fixed on her the way they had been at the auction, like he could see through all her pretending. Alia swallowed and tried to straighten, but the movement made her chest tighten. "I'm making breakfast," she said. And when he didn't speak, she added, "Earning my place." His jaw tightened, not in anger exactly, but in something that looked like pain. "I told you," he said, "you don't need to earn anything." Alia turned back to the stove because she couldn't handle being looked at like that, like she mattered, and she whispered, "People like me always have to earn what we're given." Ryan stepped closer, and his voice dropped, firm and controlled. Not here. She wanted to argue, but a cough rose up sharp, and she caught it fast, turning away so he wouldn't see how it shook her. And when it passed, she kept her face down, ashamed anyway. Mrs. Chun appeared then, quiet as a cat, taking in the scene in one glance. And before Alia could protest, she slid in beside her, gently removing the spoon from her hand. "You sit," Mrs. Chun said, not unkindly. And then she looked at Ryan as if confirming an order. Ryan nodded once. "Light tasks only," he said. "Eyes still on Alia, and she eats." Alia frowned, confused, but Ryan added something that stunned her more than the guest room had. "With me." When they sat at the table, Alia on one side and Ryan across from her, the quiet felt louder than the wagon ride because this wasn't normal. Ranch owners didn't eat with women bought at auctions, not in any town she'd ever seen, and she kept her shoulders tight, afraid of doing something wrong. Ryan asked simple questions: where she'd come from, what she liked to eat, whether she could read, and she answered carefully, giving only pieces, not the whole story, because the whole story was too ugly to lay on clean wood and morning light. Still, the talk softened around the edges, and for a second it almost felt like a real breakfast between two people, until both reached for the coffee pot at the same time and their fingers brushed. Alia froze like she'd been burned, and Ryan went still too, their hands hovering for a breath in the air. And then he pulled back first, clearing his throat, but not before Alia saw it, his eyes, the way they held a hunger that scared her more than his money ever could. Over the next days, Alia tried to do what she'd promised herself: be small, be useful, be easy to keep. She helped Mrs. Chun fold linens, shell peas, wipe shelves, and she smiled when she could, but the ranch was big, and even small tasks stole strength she didn't have. She learned the spots where she could hide when a coughing came: the far side of the barn, behind the feed shed, near the chicken coop where the noise covered her gasps. And when blood came up, she wrapped it quick in her handkerchief and tucked it away like a secret sin. Ryan noticed anyway. He noticed she barely touched her food, unless Mrs. Chun watched her like a hawk. He noticed the way she walked slower each afternoon. He noticed how she tried to stand tall when ranch hands passed, even when her shoulders trembled. And he began leaving small things without saying a word. A little bunch of wildflowers in a tin cup on her nightstand, a clean shawl folded neatly at the foot of her bed, and one evening, a thin book of poetry set beside the lamp like it had always belonged there. Alia stared at it for a long time, her throat tight, because it was the kind of book she'd once loved before life had knocked all beauty out of her. And she couldn't understand how he'd known. In the yard, men whispered when they thought he wasn't near. "She won't last a month," one muttered. "Boss made a bad investment," another said with a laugh that died fast when Ryan stepped out of the barn like he'd risen from the ground itself. He didn't shout, but his calm was sharper than yelling. "You speak of her with respect," he said, eyes hard, "where you leave my ranch." The men went quiet, heads dropping, and Alia watched from a window, shaken, because no one had ever defended her name like it had value. On the fourth day, she went out to feed the chickens to prove to herself she could still do something alone. And for a few minutes the fresh air helped, the birds clucking around her feet, the sun warm on her face, but then the world tilted without warning. Her vision narrowed, the ground seemed to rise, and she felt her legs give way like they no longer belonged to her. She didn't even hit the dirt. Strong arms caught her, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. And when her eyes fluttered open, she saw Ryan's face close to hers, fear carved into it so plainly it stole her breath. "Alia," he said, voice tight, and he carried her inside as if he didn't care who saw, as if pride meant nothing compared to her staying alive for one more minute. He laid her on the sofa, and she tried to sit up, mortified, but he pressed her down gently. "Don't," he said, "just breathe." Mrs. Chun hurried in with cool cloths and a glass of water, clucking under her breath in a language Alia didn't understand, and Alia, dizzy with shame, whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." because apologizing was the only thing she'd been taught to do when her body failed. Ryan knelt beside the sofa, took her hand, and his voice softened, almost rough with something he didn't know how to hold. "Stop apologizing for being human," he said, and when she tried to look away, he shifted so she couldn't. "You need to tell me the truth," he continued, steady but pleading under it. "How sick are you?" Alia's chest tightened, not just from illness now, but from fear that honesty would end this kindness for good. She stared at the ceiling, blinking hard, and then the wall inside her finally cracked. "The doctor in my last town said consumption," she admitted, voice breaking. "Said I had months, maybe weeks. I came to the auction because I had nowhere else to die." The words hung in the room like smoke, and for a second Ryan didn't move at all, his face unreadable, and Alia's stomach turned cold as she waited for him to stand up and walk away, to send her out like everyone else had. Instead, he rose sharply, not in disgust, but in decision, and he looked down at her with a fierce steadiness that made her forget how to breathe. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we're riding to see the best doctor in the territory." Alia's eyes widened. "Ryan, there's no point," she tried, but his voice cut through her like a rope pulled tight. "There's every point," he said, and his gaze held hers without mercy, like he refused to let her surrender. "I didn't choose you to watch you give up." Then he turned and walked out, boots firm on the floorboards, leaving Alia staring after him with something warm and terrifying blooming in her chest, because for the first time in a long time, someone was acting like her life was worth fighting for. 3 days after Ryan promised the doctor, the ranch felt like it was holding its breath because Alia tried to act better than she was, and Ryan tried to pretend he didn't see through it. But sickness has a way of taking what it wants when it wants it. Alia kept to light work with Mrs. Chun, smiled when spoken to, and even sat at the breakfast table like she belonged there. Yet the moment she was alone, she hid the truth behind closed doors and quiet corners, pressing her forehead to cool wood, waiting for the pounding in her head to ease, waiting for her lungs to stop burning, telling herself she just had to make it through each hour without causing trouble. That morning, Ryan rode out with the ranch hands to check cattle in the far pasture, leaving Jonas behind to mend fencing. And Alia told herself it was good, because she could cough without those steady eyes watching her. But by midday, the weakness had deepened into something heavier, like a stone tied to her ribs. She walked down the hallway, carrying clean linens, and suddenly the world narrowed, her vision dimming at the edges, and a violent cough hit her so hard it doubled her over. She tried to swallow it, tried to keep it inside, but it tore out of her in harsh bursts, and when she pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, the cloth came away spotted dark. Fear shot through her, sharp and cold, and she stumbled toward her room, desperate to hide before anyone saw. But her legs buckled in the hall, and she slid to the floor, the linen spilling like fallen snow around her. Mrs. Chin's footsteps came fast, and when she turned the corner and saw Alia shaking on the floor, her face tightened with alarm. She knelt, lifting Alia's shoulders, calling her name, but Alia couldn't answer, her breath too broken, her mind drifting in and out like a candle struggling against wind. "Jonas!" Mrs. Chin shouted, her voice cutting through the house, and Jonas rushed in, taking one look and going pale. Mrs. Chun grabbed his sleeve. "Ride," she ordered, urgent and fierce. "Find Mr. Ryan. Now." Jonas didn't argue. He ran for the stable, and within minutes a horse thundered down the ranch road, dust rising behind him like smoke. Inside, Mrs. Chun and one of the ranch hands carried Alia to bed, laying her down gently. But Alia's skin burned and her eyes rolled back, and another cough shook her until she made a weak, helpless sound that broke Mrs. Chin's heart. "Easy," Mrs. Chun murmured, wiping her mouth and chin, smoothing damp hair away from her forehead, but Alia's body didn't listen. Time stretched, thick and slow, until hoofbeats finally pounded into the yard like an answer to a prayer, and Ryan burst through the front door with a look on his face that made the whole house seem smaller. He crossed the hall in long strides, not stopping to remove his hat, not stopping to ask questions twice. When he reached Alia's room and saw her unconscious, her cheeks flushed with fever and her breath ragged, something in him tightened like a rope pulled to its limit. "Where is Jonas?" he snapped, voice raw. Mrs. Chun stepped aside. "He rode for you, and you came," she said, then pointed at the handkerchief on the floor. The stain was unmistakable. Ryan stared at it for a second too long, like his mind refused to accept what his eyes were saying, and then he turned and barked an order to a ranch hand, "Saddle my fastest horse. Jonas, when he returns, rides to town for Doc Morrison. No stopping for anything." A man hesitated. "Mr. Hale, the road." Ryan's voice dropped, deadly calm. "He doesn't stop." He moved back to the bed, and when Alia shifted restlessly, whispering nonsense through cracked lips, Ryan reached down and took her hand, his big, calloused fingers wrapping around her thin ones like he could hold her to the earth by force alone. "Alia," he said, bending close, and her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her fevered voice slipped out in broken pieces, words that sounded like old pain surfacing. "Nobody wanted me," she murmured, barely audible. "Last choice, why did you?" Ryan swallowed hard, his throat tight, and for a moment the proud rancher looked like a man facing something he could not buy or command. "Because I saw you," he said, voice breaking just enough to scare him. "Really saw you." When Doc Morrison finally arrived near sunset, his bag swinging as he hurried in, he examined Alia with quick, practiced hands, listened to her chest, checked her pulse, and then stepped into the hallway with Ryan, shutting the door behind them like he was closing the world out. The doctor's face was grim in the lamplight. "Advanced," he said quietly, and Ryan's eyes sharpened. "Don't speak in riddles," Ryan demanded. "Tell me what you see." The doctor exhaled. "Consumption, Mr. Hale. Severe. And she's badly malnourished. Exhausted to the bone. I'm surprised she's alive." Ryan's jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might crack. "What can we do?" he asked, and the question held a desperation Jonas had never heard from him, not even in storms or fires. The doctor's gaze dropped. "Make her comfortable," he said. "Keep her warm. Keep her fed as best you can. Don't let her overexert. And don't let her be alone." Ryan's voice turned sharp, refusing. "That's not an answer." The doctor met his eyes, gentle but firm. "It's the only honest one. A few weeks, maybe a month if she's lucky." Ryan went still, the words hitting like a bullet you don't hear until after it lands. "There has to be something," he said through clenched teeth. "Medicine. Treatment." The doctor shook his head once. "Nothing that cures this," he said softly. "I'm sorry." Ryan stared at the closed bedroom door like he could will it open to a different ending, then turned on his heel and strode away, not to abandon her, but to fight the helplessness clawing at his chest. He sent Jonas, who had returned sweaty and wide-eyed from the ride, to another town for a second opinion, then another, refusing to accept the first verdict like it was law, and when night fell, he sat beside Alia's bed anyway, refusing sleep as if closing his eyes would invite death to step in. He wiped her forehead with cool cloths, watched each breath like it was a fragile thread, and when her fingers twitched in his grasp, he held on tighter, whispering promises he didn't fully understand himself. Sometime near dawn, the fever finally loosened its grip. Alia's breathing eased, her skin cooled, and her eyes fluttered open to find Ryan slumped in a chair beside her bed, unshaven, exhausted, still holding her hand even in sleep. She stared at him for a long moment, the sight filling her with a painful warmth, because no one had ever stayed like this. And when she whispered, "Ryan," his eyes snapped open instantly, as if he'd been waiting on the edge of waking all night. "Alia," he breathed, relief crashing through him. "Thank God. How do you feel?" Her voice was weak but clear. "Weak," she admitted, then added, "but you stayed." Ryan's gaze didn't waver. "Where else would I be?" he said, and when she whispered, "You barely know me," his answer came raw and honest, the kind that scares you because it's real. I know enough. Alia's throat tightened as the truth pressed in from all sides, and she asked the question she was terrified to hear answered. The doctor told you, didn't he? Ryan's shoulders stiffened. He told me what he thinks, he said, voice low. Doesn't mean I accept it. Alia tried to shake her head, tears forming. Ryan, you can't fight this. He stood, determination hardening his face like steel set in fire. Watch me, he said, and the words were not a threat, but a vow. He moved toward the door, then paused as if the next sentence nearly escaped him, as if it was too dangerous to say out loud. Alia's voice trembled. Why you care so much? Ryan froze, his hand on the doorframe, and for one breath the truth nearly spilled out, but he swallowed it back like it could destroy them both. Rest now, he said instead, too fast, too careful. We'll talk when you're stronger. Then he left the room, and Alia lay there staring after him, her heart aching with a terrible new understanding. He cared in a way that could break him, and the more she felt it, the more she feared what her dying would do to the man who had chosen her when no one else would. The days that followed moved with a strange softness, like the ranch itself had quieted so Alia could breathe. And though she was still weak, the fever had loosened enough for her to sit up and drink broth without shaking, and Ryan began to appear in her doorway, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for the richest rancher in the territory to carry a tray like a hired hand. He brought meals himself, simple things, warm and steady, then sat nearby, pretending to read papers while his eyes never truly left her. And when her strength ran out before her appetite, he didn't scold, only said, one more spoon, like he was bargaining with fate. One afternoon, he surprised her by opening her poetry book and reading aloud in a voice that was rough but careful, stumbling over a few lines, then trying again, and Alia watched him like he was a miracle made of dust and stubbornness, because no man had ever tried to enter her world that way. When she could stand for short moments, he carried her to the porch wrapped in blankets, and they watched sunsets spill across the prairie in deep oranges and purples, the sky so wide it made her chest ache, and Alia, almost without meaning to, started pointing out small beauties. Hawks circling high, a rabbit darting through grass, wildflowers holding their color even in dry soil. And Ryan listened like he'd forgotten those things existed until she named them. The ranch hands noticed the change in him before either of them could admit it. His temper softened, his shoulders seemed less weighed down, and once, when he passed a young ranch hand struggling with a broken cinch strap, he stopped and fixed it himself instead of barking an order, leaving the boy stunned. Jonas cornered him in the barn one evening, leaning against a stall door with the look of a man who'd decided the truth was better than silence. You're in love with her, Jonas said, blunt as a hammer. Ryan didn't deny it this time. His eyes stayed on a saddle he was cleaning, but his voice came out low and certain. Yes. Jonas let out a slow breath. Does she know? Ryan's hand paused on the leather. She's dying, he said, like that answered everything. Jonas shook his head. That's not an answer either, he replied. Maybe it's exactly what she needs to hear. That night, as if Jonas's words had lodged under his skin, Ryan brought Alia a bowl of soup that smelled slightly scorched, and when she took one sip, she coughed out a weak laugh despite herself. Did you make this? She asked, eyes watering. Ryan's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Yes, he admitted. Mrs. Chun said you needed more salt. I may have misunderstood how much. Alia's laugh turned into a soft, surprised sound that warmed the room, and for a moment the sickness wasn't the loudest thing between them. He sat on the edge of the chair and lifted the spoon. You're going to eat it anyway, he said, even if it's terrible. Alia looked at him, then at the spoon, and her voice softened into something brave. Why did you really bid on me at that auction? Ryan went still, like the question hit a place he'd been guarding, and for a long breath he said nothing. Then finally he spoke, slow and honest. I saw you standing there, he said, and you looked like I fell. Alia frowned, confused. What do you mean? Ryan's gaze held hers, steady and exposed. Alone, he said, Like the world had used you up and forgotten you were still human. Alia's breath caught, and he continued before fear could stop him. I built this ranch, he said quietly. Land, money, respect. Men tip their hats. Women smile. And I come home to empty rooms and realize I'm just surviving, not living. Alia's voice trembled, guarding her heart even as it leaned toward him. So you bought a dying woman to fill your empty house? Ryan shook his head once firm. No, he said. I chose a woman whose eyes told me she understood what it means to be lonely even when you're breathing. The words hung between them like something sacred, and Alia's eyes filled as she whispered, I don't have long, Ryan. You'll be alone again soon. Ryan leaned closer, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but unbreakable. Then I've had something real, he said, even if it was brief. That's more than I've had in 10 years. Alia's tears slipped down, and before she could wipe them, his thumb brushed her cheek, calloused and gentle, as if he were learning how to touch without fear. Don't waste your time on me, she whispered, and Ryan's eyes flashed with a fierce tenderness. It's my time to waste, he said. And you're not a waste, Alia. You never were. Pre-dawn darkness wrapped the Hale ranch in a cold hush, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel like a sin, and Alia moved through it like a shadow, holding her breath between coughs, her small bundle tucked under her arm, because she had made her choice in the night, and she was terrified she would lose her nerve if she saw Ryan's face again. Her chest ached, her legs felt hollow, but her mind was clear in the cruel way it gets when your heart is breaking on purpose. In the kitchen, she found the table where she'd eaten with him like she belonged, and she set down a folded note with shaking fingers, the words simple because there was no strength left for fancy ones. Thank you for showing me kindness when I've forgotten what it felt like. I can't let you watch me die. You deserve more than a ghost. Find someone who can give you the life you deserve. Alia. She stared at her own handwriting for one long second, then turned away fast, because if she lingered she would start crying again and the noise might wake the house. She slipped out the front door into the cold air, the sky still ink black with only a thin line of gray forming on the horizon, and she started down the long ranch road, each step sending a dull pain through her ribs. Behind her, the house looked peaceful, almost gentle, and it felt wrong that something so warm could exist while she was leaving it. Tears blurred her eyes, but she wiped them hard with the back of her sleeve and whispered to herself like a prayer, this is mercy. This is love, because she truly believed it. She couldn't bear the thought of him holding her hand again while she faded away, couldn't stand the idea of his strong face crumpling when she stopped breathing. The sun began to rise at her back, spilling pale gold across the fields, and the beauty of it made her angry for a moment, because the world stayed beautiful even when people didn't. She kept walking anyway, stubborn and small against the wide land. Then, behind her, a sound cut through the morning, hoofbeats, fast and furious, closing the distance like thunder. Alia's whole body stiffened. She didn't turn. She told herself to keep moving, to walk faster, to pretend she hadn't heard, but her legs were weak and the road was long, and the hoofbeats only grew louder until a horse pulled up beside her in a burst of dust. Ryan swung down so quickly he nearly fell, and when he reached for her, wasn't gentle the way it had been, not at first. He grabbed her arm and spun her around, and his eyes were wild with fear and fury mixed together in a way that made her throat close. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, his voice rough, like he'd been ripped open. Alia looked down because she couldn't stand the hurt shining in his face. Letting you go before it's too late, she said, and the words came out broken. Ryan's grip loosened, but his hand stayed on her shoulders like he was afraid she'd vanish. Too late for what? He snapped. Alia's chest heaved as she fought a cough. Too late to save yourself the pain of losing me, she cried, finally lifting her eyes. I heard the doctor. 2 weeks, Ryan. Why would you waste that on what? He cut in, voice rising. on the only person who's made me feel alive in 10 years. Alia shook her head, tears spilling. I don't want to hurt you, she whispered. Ryan stepped closer, his voice dropping into something fierce and steady. You hurt me by leaving, he said. You think I won't grieve you just because you're not in my house when you die? You think distance makes death smaller. Alia's breath caught on a sob. I was trying to spare you, she said, and Ryan's face twisted like the idea was unbearable. Then, right there in the dusty road with sunrise painting the world behind her, Ryan Hale did something Alia never would have expected from a man like him. He dropped to his knees, not to beg like a weak man, but to tell the truth like a brave one. He took her hands in his, holding them tight, and his voice shook only once. I love you, Alia, he said. Alia's knees nearly buckled. Ryan, don't I love you, he repeated, louder, like he needed the sky to hear it too. I loved you when you apologized for existing. I loved you through every fever night. I love you now. Alia sobbed, shaking her head. I'm dying, she whispered. Ryan's eyes filled, but he didn't look away. I know, he said, and his voice cracked. And it's killing me. But I'd rather have 2 weeks of loving you truly than 40 more years of that empty half-life I was living. Alia stared at him, terrified and warmed all at once. And the words she'd been holding back finally escaped like a breath she'd needed for years. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have since you fed me that terrible soup. Ryan let out a broken laugh through tears, then pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was real, and he was refusing to let go. When he leaned back, his hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks as if memorizing her. Marry me, he said, sudden and urgent. Alia froze, the world tilting again, but this time it wasn't sickness. It was the weight of what that yes would mean. Alia's breath caught, as if the word marry had stolen the air from the morning. And for a long moment, she could only stare at Ryan's face, dust on his boots, tears still clinging at the corners of his eyes, that fierce hope in him like a fire refusing to go out, and the fear in her chest battled with a sudden, aching joy, because part of her wanted to say yes so badly it hurt, while another part whispered that she would be sealing his heartbreak. Ryan, that's insane, she managed voice, trembling, and he shook his head like he wouldn't allow the idea of waiting. Then call me insane, he said, hands still warm on her cheeks. But give me your answer. The sun climbed higher, lights spilling over the fields, and Alia realized that if she said no, she would be denying them the only honest thing left, love without promises of forever. Her eyes filled again, and she nodded, the movement small but sure. Yes, she whispered. Then, louder, like she needed to hear it herself. Yes, I'll marry you. Ryan's whole body seemed to exhale, and he lifted her carefully onto the horse as if she were something precious, settling her against his chest so she could feel the strong beat of his heart through his shirt. The ride back to the ranch was fast but gentle where he could make it so. And when they reached the yard, he didn't waste a single breath. He swung down, helped her inside, and called for Jonas with a voice that carried across the porch like an order to time itself. Jonas took one look at their faces and seemed to understand without explanation. Today, he asked anyway, stunned. Right now, Ryan said, every moment matters. Jonas ran to saddle a horse for town, and Mrs. Chun, hearing the commotion, appeared in the hallway with her hands on her hips, ready to scold until she saw Alia's tear-streaked face and the ringless tenderness in Ryan's eyes. For a beat, Mrs. Chun said nothing. Then she nodded once firm. Come, she told Alia, steering her toward the back rooms. We will make you ready. Alia tried to protest that she had nothing, that she didn't deserve anything, but Mrs. Chun silenced her with a look that felt like a blanket placed over shaking shoulders. In a trunk tucked away like a secret, Mrs. Chun pulled out a simple white dress, plain, modest, carefully folded, the kind of dress a woman saved when she believed in a future she hadn't yet been given. It was mine, Mrs. Chin said quietly, smoothing the fabric with reverent fingers. I kept it for years. Alia's throat tightened. I can't take this, she whispered. Mrs. Chun lifted Alia's chin gently. You can, she said. He loves you like I have never seen a man love. Alia's eyes burned with fresh fear. I'm going to break his heart when I die, she confessed. Mrs. Chin's voice softened, but didn't bend. You will break it more, she said, if you do not let him love you fully. By late afternoon, the ranch house felt transformed, not grand like a city wedding, but alive in a way it hadn't been before. Wildflowers were gathered from the fields and placed in jars, their bright faces turning toward the window light. A small group waited in the parlor. Jonas, Mrs. Chun, 3 loyal ranch hands with hats in their hands, and a traveling preacher Jonas had fetched at a hard ride, still catching his breath but smiling kindly. Ryan stood near the hearth in a clean suit, hair combed, hands restless at his sides, unable to stop looking toward the hallway where Alia would appear, and when she finally stepped in, thin but radiant in that borrowed white. The room went so quiet you could hear the soft creak of the floorboards under her feet. Ryan's eyes widened, his throat working as if words failed him, and Alia saw him look at her like she was the only miracle he'd ever prayed for. The preacher spoke the vows in a steady voice, and when he reached the words in sickness and in health, Alia felt the whole room tighten with emotion. She saw Jonas blink hard, saw Mrs. Chun press her lips together, saw Ryan's hands tremble as he took Alia's. Then the preacher said, "Till death do us part," and Ryan's voice broke when he repeated it. But he said it firmly, looking only at her, like he was choosing this pain on purpose because the love was worth it. When it was Alia's turn, her voice was soft, but it didn't waver, and she realized she meant every word, even if her time was short. Ryan slid a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, and his thumb lingered there, tracing the circle as if he couldn't believe it was real. You may kiss your bride, the preacher said, and Ryan cupped her face like she was made of starlight, then kissed her with a tenderness that felt sacred, not hungry, not claiming, but grateful. Alia melted into him, and for a moment she forgot sickness, forgot auctions, forgot being unwanted, because she was someone's wife, someone's choice, someone's home. There was no loud celebration after, only a simple meal and quiet laughter, but Alia laughed truly for the first time in years, the sound surprising even her, and Ryan watched her like she was the sun itself, supporting her as they swayed in a slow dance that was more holding than dancing, her head against his chest, his arms around her like a promise. And then the story turned, the way life sometimes turns when you least expect kindness to become rescue. 6 months later, winter snow fell outside the kitchen window, and a woman's hands kneaded bread dough with steady strength, fuller now, healthier, humming softly as if the tune had been sleeping in her for years. When Ryan stepped inside, cold clinging to his coat, he stopped in the doorway and simply watched, wonder written plain on his face, because the woman at the table was Alia, cheeks pink with life, eyes bright, no longer a ghost. She looked up and smiled. "You're staring again," she teased. Ryan crossed the room, kissed her gently, then let his hand slide to her belly where a small, visible bump rose beneath her dress. "How are you both today?" he asked, voice thick with gratitude. "We're perfect," Alia whispered, and in the firelight later, with snow falling quiet outside, she leaned into him and said, almost in disbelief, "I should have died in that auction yard." Ryan held her close, his voice low. "You did," he said, "and then you chose to live." Alia's eyes filled, not with sorrow now, but with awe. "You gave me a reason to," she said, and Ryan shook his head, pressing his forehead to hers. "No," he murmured, "you gave yourself permission to be loved."